Warwick said something very interesting there about the limitations of the United States militarily, and how, in this Saudi-U.S. meeting, Saudi Arabia was promised F-35 jets, but all the mainstream media are saying that isn't coming for years, probably. And then you also have this very curious row that I'm sure you've been following between China and Japan, which I think has very interesting timing, given it comes directly after the Trump administration's meeting with China in South Korea. And I'm just going to pull up this piece by the Washington Post. China punishes Japan's new leader with harsh words and economic pain. So essentially, on November 7th, Prime Minister Takaichi of Japan suggested that Japan could intervene militarily if Beijing makes good on to its threat to invade Taiwan. Now, what's happened is that China has warned Chinese travelers not to go to Japan. This is having economic ramifications. There's also talks of trade restrictions being imposed on the China-Japan relationship. And there have been demonstrations of China's military might. Of course, there have been ships sailing through nearby waters. So, Carl, what does this all have to do? We heard so much about the Abraham Accords. Saudi's going to get boosted with so much U.S. support. Then we have a major U.S. colony, essentially, Japan, getting into direct conflict with China right after Trump's visit. What does this tell you about the state of the U.S.'s foreign policy at the moment?
I just want to follow up on what Warwick said about U.S. military-industrial complex will not be able to deliver. The thing is, the U.S. military-industrial complex is not designed to fight war. It's designed for grift, and it does that very well. I mean, it doesn't matter when they're going to finally deliver the F-35. The more important part is a tribute that's been paid by Saudi Arabia to United States. This is the same relationship that's been playing out with Taiwan and U.S. for years. Everybody on Taiwan knows, they are sending in form of tributes tons of money to Washington to purchase these very outdated and expensive weapon programs that will do nothing. That will have very little value in case of war, but they just got to keep paying to be on U.S. good terms. And these weapon systems that Taiwan purchases, they usually take decades for U.S. to deliver. So I mean, it's never about to actually deliver those weapons. The more important part is to continually funnel funds into the U.S. military-industrial complex. Like KJ said, this is a vampire that continually need to be fed. This is why they arrested Assange, because Assange has pointed out NATO and U.S. military were in Afghanistan to win the war in Afghanistan. The whole purpose of Afghan war was to wash the vast sum of money from the taxpayer bases of North America and Europe into the pockets of a small transnational security elite. That it did very well. The only problem is that require the U.S. empire to be in the perpetual war to pivot from one war to next. This is what we have seen, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Libya to Ukraine, and now they're looking for another place to start the conflict. Now, for the U.S. military-industrial complex, it's actually not necessary to start a World War III, versus China. All they got to do is keep the tension up, so the arms sales will continue to flow. Again, when they're going to deliver weapons, that's secondary. The most important thing is the tribute must be paid to the United States. In the particular case of the Japanese Prime Minister making the remark on U.S. will intervene militarily if some Chinese warship appear on the coast of Taiwan, because it will be an existential issue for Japan. Now, a lot of the Western commentator ignores this is actually a drastic departure from the Japan's own constitution, the Article 9 of Japan's peace constitution, which was imposed on Japan after World War II, but has remained very popular among the Japanese population, because many rightly saw it's because of the pivoting away from the militarism of World War II that enabled Japan to have the post-war economic miracle. Now, the Article 9 of the Japan Peace Constitution says Japan is not going to have a military, but a quote-unquote self-defense force that will be limited in the defense of Japan. Now, what the Japanese Prime Minister has done is she's following the footsteps of the former right-wing Japanese Prime Minister, especially in the case of Shinzo Abe, who has been trying to openly reinterpret the Article 9 of the Peace Constitution to allow Japan to build up its military force, remilitarize, and to deploy troops outside of Japan. So before they say, oh well, this is what she is saying is, this is a existential issue for Japan if something happened to Taiwan. That's why we must deploy our military. So we're still doing it in self-defense, which is completely bogus. And also this crossed China's red line. This is the reddest of China's red line, which says Taiwan is part of China, and the Taiwan issue is to be solved by the Chinese people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. And by Japan, by saying they're going to send in the military to Taiwan, also revoke historical memories, because the one time Taiwan was severed from China was due to the first Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895, when China was forced to give up the island of Taiwan to the Empire of Japan. That made Taiwan a Japanese colony for 50 years until the end of World War II, when Japan was forced to give up Taiwan. There was actually a famous Taiwanese influencer, Jim Boss. He actually said, look, the risk of war breaking out between mainland China and Taiwan is actually not great. But if Japan is going to get involved, suddenly that possibility of war went to like 100% overnight. Because this is a lot of people do not understand. Taiwan is an emotional issue for China and the Chinese people. You cannot expect China, because it's an emotional issue. You can't always expect China going to act rationally around this. China has said time and time again, if you step over the red line, which is Taiwan independence, there's going to be war. And if Japan is going to dip its foot into this, there's going to be war. There's no question about that. And of course, because the Japan-U.S. security alliance, that will drag in United States, and then World War III is on. So this is actually, I'm actually arguing this might not be necessarily Washington pushing the Japanese Prime Minister to make the statement, because this is at the time when we are reaching a point where United States is carrying out a tactical retreat, from directly confronting China. This is what we saw in the Trump meeting in South Korea. There's now another temporary truce in the trade war. And this is why we saw that Pentagon leak, where it says maybe U.S. should deprioritize containing China and focus on its own backyard, by which they mean to pivot to Venezuela. So I think at this juncture, there are people's like the very right-wing Japanese Prime Minister who saw that U.S. is pivoting away from Western Asia, and they will be the one that's left holding the bag to face a resurgent China. So this is their effort to try to drag United States back in. It's very similar, like how Netanyahu his hardest try to drag United States in directly in war against Iran. Like because Netanyahu, his job is to be the U.S. proxy, but U.S. don't want to get directly involved in Iran, rather to do it through Israel. If anyone is going to get bombed, it's going to be Tel Aviv. But very similarly, the right wing politicians of Japan have somehow based the cornerstone, or they made the Japan-U.S. security pact cornerstone of their policy for decades, right? And suddenly they saw U.S. is departing somewhat to pivoting away from directly confronting China to maybe contain Chinese and Russian influence in Latin America. So this is their screaming for help. You can think of this as in similar vein, like the Gulf monarchies were hedging by joining BRICS, by talking about pricing oil in dollars in order to get Washington to make more concessions. That paved the way for the MBS visit to Washington. I think a very similar dynamic is going on. The Japanese Prime Minister is creating this crisis in order to drag the United States back in East Asia. I don't know. Maybe I'd like to hear the opinion of our other panelists on this as well.
Well, let's KJ. Yeah, maybe you can put this into context. As this was happening, there was also this arms sale that was made that China also had to issue a warning to Trump over, an arms sale to Taiwan, about $330 million worth, including helping Taiwan with the capability to meet current threats and maintaining the operational readiness of the recipient's fleet of F-16 and C-130. So, KJ, to you, help us put all of this into context here.
Yeah, usually I agree with Carl almost 100%, but here I have a difference of opinion. And I think that if you pan out, you look at all the things, there's a raft of new legislation that escalates tensions in Taiwan. As I mentioned, USFK has just released a new map of how they see war with China. You can see also that, for example, the rotation has been increased to 3 years in Korea. Usually single service members stay for 24 months. That has been increased to 36 years to increase operational effectiveness. And so there are a whole raft of small measures that if you put them together, you can see there's continual escalation to war with China. There is no de-escalation. It's simply that if you focus on a single item, it looks like things are being shifted around from one place to another, but it's a shell game. They still have control. Do not be misdirected by, the focus on a single item or a single direction. The U.S. leadership has come out very clearly and said in the Stars and Stripes that they consider China to be part of the homeland. The Pacific, they said, is part of the homeland. So when they talk about retrenching and focusing back on the homeland, we have to understand it in the context that they understand the Pacific as part of the homeland. And as I said before, China in this global contest is the main dish. They are not going to abandon the main dish as far as I can tell. So if we understand it inside that context, then we also have to understand that whatever Takaichi, Prime Minister Takaichi is doing has a long continuity with everything else that was being done before, starting with Shinzo Abe and the pivot to Asia, etc. There's clear continuity, and it's all part of the same pattern. It's all part of the strategic escalation, except that Prime Minister Takaichi, she kind of she let the mask slip and she said what they were actually thinking and planning. So going back to the specifics of it, she said that if, quote unquote, China were to involve the use of warships and the exercise of force, then by any measure it could constitute a situation threatening Japan's survival. That term, sonritsu kiki jitai, a situation, a survival threatening situation, has a very specific meaning in Japanese history and in Japanese law. First, it's a precedent that the Japanese always use this term when they initiate war of aggression. They've always used this term. And secondly, that term has specific legal meaning in Japanese law. It's the specific casus belli terminology that Shinzo Abe wrote into legislation in 2015 that would justify Japan's involvement in expeditionary aggressive war that was not in defense of its territory. You can go on and look up the actual legislation. It's very, very specific, and it's the fourth clause that allows Japan to go to war without actually being attacked or invaded. If you want to think of it in domestic terms, it's essentially the killer cop excuse expanded to interstate conflict. That is, the police, they always say after they shoot somebody, I felt unsafe, and therefore I had to shoot the suspect. It's that clause inserted into Japanese law. And at the time of the legislation, Taiwan was never explicitly mentioned, but it was implied. It was written as a kind of a generic clause to allow Japan to expand militarily and to completely undercut Article 9 commitments. But this is the first time it has been explicitly and officially used to refer to Taiwan by Takaichi, in an official context. And once again, to understand the geopolitical context, we have to see this as, a six-step syllogism. The U.S. wants war with China. It has not abandoned its plans, as far as I can tell. Taiwan will be the likely trigger for war. And according to all the war games by CSIS and other organizations, Japan will be critical for the war. It has the third most powerful navy in the world. It has to get involved. Whether the US prevails or doesn't prevail hinges on Japan's participation. And so what Takaichi has just done is she has stated outright, but she's also manufacturing legal and political justification for Japanese aggression against China, as it functions as a U.S. proxy in the case of war. And what this overlooks, as Carl points out, is Taiwan is part of China. As the Chinese Foreign Ministry has said, Taiwan 是中国的 Taiwan. Taiwan is China's Taiwan. And therefore, Japan's military involvement in Taiwan, an internal Chinese matter, would be a violation of international law. A foreign power like Japan is not allowed to use military means to intervene against a sovereign state taking sovereign actions within its sovereign territory, which Taiwan is. In fact, anything Japan does would be considered war of aggression, the supreme international crime, and what it was taken down for in post-World War II era. And so China is sending a very, very sharply worded early warning to Japan to not get involved in our sovereign affairs. They're sending the message to Japan that they are not deceived, they are not going to be, taken for fools, and that Japan, if it gets involved, will be aggressing China, and after that, all bets are off. Now, the unfortunate thing is that Takaichi has refused to withdraw her statement because essentially this is what the US and her handlers have wanted her to say. This is what she's thinking, and so she won't withdraw it. And of course, she's the right person for this escalation because she's an unrepentant militarist and a flagrant historical revisionist. She denies the Nanjing massacre, Japanese wrongdoing in World War II. She sees no problem with worshiping war criminals at Yasukuni Shrine. She claims that the military comfort women don't exist. And of course, she's met multiple times with DPP leaders to offer her support. She's offered, military cooperation, etc. And this is the third or fourth time that China has actually been warning her. And so she represents the extreme ultra far right sector of the LDP, the Japanese ruling party, the one party state that wants a restoration of the empire of Japan through war with China. This is literally the headcutter faction of the LDP, the ultra-fascistic warmonger class. And she belongs to, the fascistic deep state, that is to say, Nippon Kaigi. These are the deep state fascists of Japan. And also she represents the Seiwa, Seisaku, Kenkikai, which is, the Shinzo Abe faction inside the LDP. This is the Japanese fascist deep state. And she is the cross between, Margaret Thatcher and Zolani and Zelensky. And she's tasked with carrying out this long program of remilitarization and waging war with China. And by what she has said, I believe that Japan has crossed the Rubicon, and we are in very, very dangerous territory unless there is a full retraction of the statement.
Yeah, Warwick, I want you to bring us home here on this. I want to play Japan's particular response to China's measures that were put into place after Takaichi's comments. To KJ No's point there, actually, I think Margaret Thatcher is one of her heroes, so a lot of her actions can be explained there. But here is Japan's response, and then you can take us home with this, Warwick.
I believe that this announcement, which seems to curtail the exchange of people between the two countries, including study abroad and tourism, is incompatible with the broad direction of promoting a strategic, mutually beneficial relationship confirmed by the leaders and building a constructive and stable relationship. We have made a firm request for the Chinese side to take appropriate steps. Such activities by Chinese Coast Guard vessels violate international law. We have lodged a strong protest through diplomatic channels regarding this matter and firmly requested them to leave Japan's territorial waters immediately.
So, Warwick, Japan sent an envoy almost in a scrambling fashion to work out the issues that have arisen since Takaichi's reckless comments. Bring us home here. What's your assessment?
Look, I think it's pretty hard to bring it home when the other guys have done so well, but I'll give it a go and hopefully just add a few additional pieces to it, because I think the discussion so far has been incredibly thorough and rich. Those comments from the Japanese, perhaps they could have a little look in the mirror. If you want to talk about something being part of a normal, bilateral relationship that looks to explore and secure avenues for mutual benefit, well, you don't actually talk about how you're going to military intervene in another country's matter. So I'm going to put that aside, because I think that's in essence gratuitous nonsense. Let's try and sort of take stock. I did call the new Japanese Prime Minister part of the neo-fascists of the Japanese body politic on another program in the last few days. So I've sort of put it out there, and I do tend to agree with the others that we have a rising dimension of militarism in Japan, which she certainly represents. It's not a universal view across the Japanese population. I think it's important also to understand that countries are never quite single unified actors, but nonetheless, at a political level, the head of the government is certainly reflective of very, very strong militaristic views and historically revisionist views, to a point where I think neo-fascist is an appropriate description of her. I think also it is fair to say that the United States continues to want to contain or even confront China. The idea that there is some kind of a retrenchment towards a recognition of coexistence, I think, is misplaced optimism at best, and probably a little bit of naivety at worst, one that tends to focus a little bit on a few words spoken here and there, such as Marco Rubio's comments earlier this year about the recognition that the world's multipolar, when in fact, if you look at the actions, both at a funding level and in terms of physical materiality, we do continue to see efforts by the Americans or their allies to muscle up in the Western Pacific. Not so much the Americans directly, though, because in part they are pushing their allies and to do a lot more than they have historically. Now, this story, of course, has been played out once before and in recent times, and we've seen it happen in Europe. So what we are, I think, witnessing here is an Asian variance on the Ukraine playbook. The United States is seeking to instigate provocations in and around Taiwan as a way of putting pressure onto China, keeping China notionally on the back foot. There have been moves, as I'm sure many of your viewers know, over the last few years for a pretty intensive effort to revise what the one China policy means, the salami slicing that's been taking place around this. And I think these comments by the Japanese Prime Minister are part and parcel of this sort of wider, full spectrum effort to prosecute American ambitions to contain China or ultimately with the possibility of confronting China. Having said that, I think that it does give rise to some possible complex consequences which don't follow in a linear fashion. And in large part, that's because we're dealing with a very, very large country and a large economy with significant economic, material, and military capability, namely China, who clearly has demonstrated a willingness to push back quickly and in a very, very forceful way. I think China has perhaps observed the consequences of giving too much credence to the, shall we say, the integrity and the sincerity of Western overtures, and by watching what has happened in Europe very, very closely from the time of the Maidan events through to the Minsk I and II agreements, which ultimately were efforts by the West to mislead the Russians and dupe them into not preparing for war. I think China's learned from that, and it's not going to fall for that. And the responses we've seen, I think, reflect those lessons. The other reasons why I think the consequences of these words is going to be quite non-linear and difficult to predict is that the region itself is very, very sensitive to Japanese militarization, and going a little bit too far does raise in the minds of many across the region that the things that they are most concerned about Japan as a consequence of Japanese atrocities and barbarism during the Second World War period and the years immediately preceding are back to haunt the region again. So if this is an effort by the Japanese to win friends and influence people in the region, then I suspect it runs the risk of falling flat, and that's going to reflect somewhat on the Americans as well. We spoke earlier in the program about the situation concerning Israel, and I think that there are a couple of things to say about that. One is that the current administration in Taiwan, the executive, Lai Ching-te's executive, is currying favor with the Israelis and the Israel lobby in an effort to influence Washington. And I don't think that actually endears themselves to many people across the region, and indeed, in fact, to many people on the island itself who find the ethnic cleansing that's been going on in Gaza to be well, absolutely appalling and disgusting. So that's one thing, and the other thing is Lai Ching has also commented about Taiwan trying to emulate Israel's sort of military positioning as, again, an example of what's happened elsewhere in the world to into the Asia region. I think China is very, very mindful of all of that. One of the things that I found a little bit odd about all of this, notwithstanding everything that I've said, is that Japan is actually in an incredibly precarious position. It has real problems. Its economic situation is anything but rosy. The latest data suggests that its economy has actually shrunk quite dramatically, in large part because of Trump's tariffs. It faces a medium-term strategic challenge around energy and food security. It has security challenges as a result of a nuclearized DPRK, which frankly is a challenge for Japan that can only be meaningfully dealt with if China is on board. And we also have growing doubts across the Japanese population. We've also seen it in Korea, that the Americans may not actually be that reliable. So given those sorts of challenges for a prime minister of Japan, it seems to me that stirring up the Taiwan question pot has a lot of downside risk and very, very little upside. If the aim was to bring the Americans in, I'm not convinced that it has. The Americans have been largely silent. But from an American point of view, it was a fantastic exercise to see how China would respond. And perhaps there's some reason for the Americans to have at least some pause for thought that this is not going to be a lay down misere, and it won't repeat itself in the way that American destabilization in Europe, unfolded. So look, I think we are living in much more fluid times than we have been. Obviously, that goes without saying. The Japanese intervention, I think, has a lot more downside for Japan than upside. Economically, we've seen the Chinese reaction already. The issues around tourism exchanges. Well, look, frankly, if the Japanese Prime Minister is going to whip up this kind of sentiment in Japan, well, if I was Chinese, I would probably be a little bit reluctant to go to Japan right now. That's not to say that I wouldn't wouldn't travel to Japan in the future, but right now, the situation's pretty hot, and it would be prudent to defer any travel and study plans until things calm down. And there's talk also of restrictions of Japanese seafood into the Chinese market. That's going to be a problem for the Japanese economy.
Oh, yeah.
There's other things too, rare earths is another one, and amongst other things. So, Japanese companies fundamentally rely upon their subsidiaries on the China mainland for profits to offset the relatively flat economic environment domestically. So in a holistic sense, I think it was incredibly irrational for the Japanese to do this, given the problems and challenges that they face as a nation. But I think for the reasons that both Carl and KJ enunciated, and there might be some slight difference of emphasis from both of them, but I think that they shed some light on why what seems to be entirely irrational nonetheless bubbled to the surface. And so here we are, right? We're in a position where China pushed back pretty firmly. I mean, China's got a whole lot more capability than the things that it's done. And let's see how the Japanese respond now. Currently, they're digging their heels in a bit officially, but I have no doubt that that the envoy and others are looking at ways to de-escalate. They pushed out. It was an unpleasant experience. They're trying to hold firm because there's obviously face and reputation and all those things at stake. But ultimately, I don't really think the Japanese have much choice. The last thing I'll say about this is that I think that we have, and this is as a consequence of Japanese actions, they've caused a new normal to be established, and that is that Chinese patrol boats will now spend a lot more time patrolling through the contested waters of the Diaoyu Islands, whereas once before they didn't do it so much. And I'm sure that was not part of the game plan. And so we do have a new normal. The Chinese naval capacity has shown that it can surround the island of Taiwan very quickly in the event that it believes that Taiwan is under threat. It has demonstrated its actual willingness and the incapacity of the Japanese to do anything about basically patrol boats, right? These are Coast Guard boats. They're sizable and all of that, but it's not the real Navy. No, we've got the Coast Guard now traipsing through the Diaoyu Islands, and the Japanese, can make representations about it. But after their breaches of international law, they really don't have much to stand on. So that's where we're at. Some new normals. Actually, one other thing that I thought was interesting, KJ mentioned this map, right? And it's been used as a way of trying to say that the Americans, and particularly Korea, is perfectly placed to prosecute a war. There is, of course, another way of viewing that map, and that is to say, gee, Seoul is perfectly in the middle of the line of fire of 3 nuclear powers. And I'm not sure that that the only other nuclear power that might come to the aid of Seoul would want to take that on. So so that map actually says to the folk in South Korea that perhaps they're on their own.